Harper was late and the team chief mocked her publicly, but when the Black Hawk needed an emergency landing, she climbed into the cockpit and did something that left everyone speechless. What happened next changed her life forever. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this incredible story from. The morning air inside Hangar 12 carried the familiar bite of aviation fuel and metal polish, but Harper Ellingson's rushed footsteps echoed against the concrete with an urgency that cut through the routine hum. Her uniform hung wrinkled against her frame, fabric still bearing the creases of a sleepless night spent folding laundry and checking homework. Details no one here would ever know or care to understand. The hangar stretched before her like a cathedral of steel and shadow, punctuated by the skeletal frames of helicopters in various stages of maintenance. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to amplify every imperfection, every sign of her hurried morning. "Well, well," Master Sergeant Colin Durnett's voice sliced through the morning stillness with surgical precision. "Look what the wind dragged in." Harper's breath caught in her throat, the sound barely audible above the distant whir of ventilation systems. She could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settling on her like lead blankets, each gaze carrying its own judgment, its own assumption about who she was and why she deserved to be here. "The Princess of Maintenance decided to grace us with her presence," Durnett continued, his words bouncing off the hangar walls with deliberate amplification. Each syllable landed with the precision of a hammer strike. Designed for maximum audience impact, the laughter started low, snickers that rippled through the gathered mechanics like stones dropped in still water. Harper kept her gaze forward, focusing on the tool cabinet 30 feet ahead, counting her steps, controlling her breathing the way she'd been taught years ago in a different life. Under different circumstances, her hands found the familiar weight of her toolbox, fingers automatically checking the latches with muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. The metal was cold against her palms, grounding her to this moment, this place, this identity she'd constructed piece by careful piece. "Think she can handle a wrench today without breaking the aircraft?" Durnett's voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who'd perfected public humiliation into an art form. Harper's right hand drifted unconsciously to her side, fingers brushing against a small, worn patch sewn into the lateral pocket of her coveralls. The fabric was faded, the edges frayed from years of washing and wear, but the numbers, 189s, remained legible in thread that had once been bright silver, now dulled to the color of old pewter. The touch was brief, reflexive, a gesture that might have been mistaken for nervousness by casual observers, but her fingers lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, as if drawing strength from the symbol that carried more weight than anyone in this hangar could possibly understand. She pulled her hand away quickly, tucking it back toward her toolbox with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself smaller, to take up less space, to avoid drawing attention to the things that mattered most. The concrete floor beneath her boots felt solid and unforgiving as she made her way to her assigned workstation. Each step was measured, controlled, never hurried enough to suggest panic, never slow enough to invite further comment. It was a delicate calibration she'd mastered over months of navigating this particular social minefield. Behind her, conversations resumed their normal rhythm, but she could still feel the occasional glance. The whispered aside, the way her presence had shifted the morning's energy from routine to spectacle. The hangar settled back into its familiar patterns, but something had changed. A tension introduced that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet anticipate. Harper opened her toolbox with deliberate care, the metal hinges squeaking softly in protest. Inside, each tool occupied its designated space with military precision. Wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers organized by type, everything clean and ready for the day's work. But tucked beneath the top tray, wrapped in a piece of worn cloth, lay two objects that belonged to a different world entirely. A dog tag bent into an unnatural curve, and a challenge coin whose surface bore scratches that told their own story. They rested there like sleeping secrets, waiting for a moment that might never come, or might come sooner than anyone expected. The morning stretched ahead with its familiar routines and unspoken hierarchies, but Harper Ellingson had learned long ago that the most important battles were often fought in silence. With weapons no one else could see, the water from the maintenance base sink ran cold against Harper's hands as she scrubbed away the morning's accumulated grime. Her movements followed a pattern etched deep into muscle memory. Palms first, then fingers, each nail cleaned with methodical precision. It was a ritual that belonged to another time, another place, but old habits died hard, especially the ones that had once meant the difference between life and death. Steam rose from the industrial-grade soap as she worked, the harsh fluorescent lighting above casting her reflection in fragmented pieces across the water's surface. She caught glimpses of herself, tired eyes, hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had loosened throughout the morning, the faint lines around her mouth that spoke of responsibilities carried alone. The break room hummed with the quiet energy of late morning, that lull between the initial rush of shift change and the afternoon push toward completion. Vending machines buzzed in the corner, their mechanical heartbeats providing a steady counterpoint to the distant sound of work continuing in the hangar beyond. Harper dried her hands on a paper towel, the rough texture catching against calloused palms. As she turned toward the exit, her fingers automatically checked the contents of her chest pocket, a folded note from her daughter's teacher, a reminder about parent-teacher conferences she'd probably missed due to shift changes, another small weight in a life already heavy with them. The sound of approaching footsteps made her shoulders straighten involuntarily, a response so ingrained she barely noticed it anymore. But instead of Durnet's measured stride, or the hurried pace of someone with an agenda, these steps carried a different rhythm, unhurried. Observant, Miles Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his gray hair catching the overhead light and his weathered face carrying the particular gravity that came with decades of military service. He moved with the careful economy of motion that marked career soldiers, even years after they'd traded uniforms for civilian work clothes. "Coffee?" he asked, nodding toward the machine that had seen better decades but somehow continued to produce something resembling caffeine. Harper hesitated, her hand still resting on the folded note in her pocket. Social interactions here felt like navigating a minefield. Too friendly and you became a target, too distant and you became isolated. Miles had always existed in a category of his own, neither friend nor enemy, just present. "Sure," she said, the word emerging quieter than she'd intended. He moved to the machine with practiced efficiency, inserting coins and making selections with the confidence of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The mechanical whir and gurgle filled the space between them as 2 cups dropped and began to fill with liquid that was optimistically labeled coffee. "You've got the calm of someone who's seen worse," Miles said without turning around, his voice carrying the particular cadence of observation rather than judgment. The comment landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the careful composure Harper had constructed. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward the hidden objects in her toolbox, 40 feet away, but somehow present in this moment. "I'm just tired," she replied, accepting the cup he offered. The ceramic was warm against her palms, providing an anchor point in a conversation that suddenly felt more significant than casual break-room chatter. Miles studied her with the patient attention of someone who'd learned to read between lines, to see the stories people carried in their posture, their breathing, the way they held their hands. "You've got a name, right? I mean, beyond what Durnet calls you." The question was simple, almost mundane, but it carried an unexpected weight. When was the last time someone here had asked her something about herself rather than her work, her schedule, her perceived shortcomings? "Harper," she said, and the sound of her own name in this space felt strange, almost foreign. "Harper." He repeated it with the careful pronunciation of someone committing it to memory. "That's better than Princess of Maintenance." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself, the first genuine expression she'd allowed herself all morning. It felt rusty, unpracticed but real. The radio mounted on the wall crackled to life, interrupting the moment with mechanical urgency. "All maintenance personnel to Station 3. We have a telemetry anomaly on the training bird. Repeat, all hands to Station 3. The coffee cup felt suddenly heavy in Harper's hands as the familiar surge of adrenaline began to build. Miles was already moving, his casual demeanor shifting into something sharper, more focused. "Duty calls," he said, but his eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than necessary. "You coming?" Harper nodded, setting down her barely touched coffee and following him toward the hangar. But as they walked, she could feel the weight of the dog tag and challenge coin in her distant toolbox. as if they were calling across the space between, reminding her that some stories, once begun, demanded their own completion. The Black Hawk sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its rotors motionless but somehow suggesting the potential for sudden, violent motion. Morning clouds had gathered overhead, casting shifting shadows across the aircraft's matte black surface and lending an ominous quality to what should have been routine maintenance protocols. Harper found herself part of the crowd that had gathered around Station 3, drawn by the radio's urgent summons and the particular gravity that surrounded aircraft emergencies. The training helicopter had returned from its morning flight with telemetry readings that fell outside normal parameters. Nothing immediately catastrophic, but enough to ground the bird until the issue could be identified and resolved. Master Sergeant Burnett stood near the aircraft's nose, clipboard in hand and irritation radiating from every line of his posture. He'd been vocal about his displeasure with the morning's disruption, the way mechanical problems had a habit of interfering with his carefully planned schedules and immaculate maintenance records. "Simple problem, simple solution," he announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying across the tarmac with practiced authority. Someone made an error during pre-flight. Someone cut corners. His gaze swept across the crowd with deliberate intent before settling on Harper. "All we need is an admission. Own up to the mistake, and we can move on without dragging this through formal channels." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire, carrying implications that everyone present understood without explicit explanation. Formal channels meant paperwork, investigations, potential disciplinary actions that could follow someone through their entire career. "Come on," Burnett continued, his tone shifting toward something that might have been mistaken for reasonableness by someone who didn't know him better. "Take the easy way out. Admit you grabbed the wrong checklist, missed a step, whatever it was. Nobody wants to see this get complicated." Harper felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being singled out, made visible in ways she'd spent months trying to avoid. Around her, she could sense the subtle shift in the crowd's attention, the way conversations paused and resumed at lower volumes, the way people positioned themselves to watch without appearing to stare. Her right hand moved involuntarily to the hidden patch on her coveralls, fingers finding the worn fabric through the material of her outer pocket. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, but it provided a moment of grounding in the face of Burnett's public challenge. "I didn't make any mistakes," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them despite its measured tone. "Really?" Burnett's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "Because someone did. And you were the last person logged for pre-flight inspection on this particular bird?" The accusation landed with the weight of bureaucratic inevitability in a world governed by checklists and documented procedures. Being the last signature on a form carried a particular kind of responsibility that was difficult to dispute or deflect. "I followed protocol," Harper replied, her hand now pressed flat against the patch, drawing strength from the symbol no one else could see or understand. Miles Hargrove stood among the watching mechanics, his experienced eyes taking in the dynamics of the confrontation with the careful attention of someone who'd witnessed similar scenes play out over decades of military service. Something in Harper's posture, in the way she held herself under pressure, seemed to catch his interest. "Just admit it," Burnett pressed, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "Take responsibility for your actions, and we can close this matter professionally." "I won't lie about something I didn't do," Harper said, and the quiet firmness in her voice seemed to surprise even her. The telemetry equipment chose that moment to emit a sharp warning tone, drawing attention back to the Black Hawk and the technical issues that had started this entire confrontation. But the tension between Harper and Burnett remained unresolved, suspended in the morning air like the gathering clouds overhead. The platform beside the Black Hawk swayed slightly as Harper climbed the maintenance stairs, her boots finding familiar purchase on the textured metal steps. The aircraft loomed above her, a complex marriage of engineering and purpose that had demanded her attention regardless of the personal dynamics playing out on the ground below. Technical necessity had driven her up here, telemetry readings that required hands-on investigation, physical inspection of systems that couldn't be diagnosed from a distance. The work demanded focus, precision, and a kind of methodical problem-solving that had nothing to do with egos or workplace politics. As she leaned across the fuselage to check a sensor array, Her coverall sleeve caught on a protruding piece of equipment. The fabric pulled taut for a moment, then released with a soft tearing sound that seemed amplified in the relative quiet surrounding the aircraft. The motion exposed the lateral pocket completely, and with it, the patch that had remained hidden through months of careful navigation. The numbers 189s were now clearly visible, embroidered in thread that had once been silver, but had faded to the color of old pewter. Surrounded by the worn remains of what might once have been a unit insignia, Miles Hargrove, standing near the aircraft's tail section, felt his attention drawn by something he couldn't immediately identify. His eyes narrowed as they focused on the patch, and his weathered face took on an expression of concentrated recall, like someone trying to remember a half-forgotten song. "I'll be damned," he murmured, his voice too quiet to carry beyond his immediate vicinity. His hand moved to the radio clipped to his belt, fingers finding the controls with automatic precision. "Base operations. This is Hargrove. I need you to pull a file for me. Unit designator 189S. It's going to be classified, probably archived." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. 189S. That's going back a few years. "Miles, what's your interest?" "Just pull it," Miles replied, his gaze never leaving Harper's position on the platform. "I'll explain later." Around the maintenance area, other personnel continued their work, but several had noticed the exchange. Durnett, in particular, seemed irritated by what he perceived as unnecessary complications to what should have been a simple matter of assigning blame and moving forward. "Probably just another souvenir," he said loudly, addressing no one in particular but ensuring his voice carried to anyone within earshot. "You know how it is. People pick up patches, coins, all kinds of military memorabilia. Doesn't mean anything." But Miles wasn't listening to Durnett's dismissive commentary. His attention was focused entirely on the radio conversation taking place in base operations, where someone was typing search parameters into a computer system that archived records dating back decades. "Found something," the voice on the radio reported. "File designation 189S dated June 2019. It's marked classified. Miles, I can see the cover sheet, but I'll need authorization to open the actual contents." "What's the cover sheet show?" "Mission designation. Evacuation support, Theater Delta, file classification, confidential and Miles. There's a name on here. Callahan. General Everett Callahan, mission commander." Miles felt something cold settle in his stomach. General Callahan wasn't just any name in the system. He was their current base commander, the man whose office sat in the building visible through the hangar's main entrance. On the platform above, Harper continued her technical inspection, unaware that her hidden identity was being systematically uncovered 40 feet below. The Black Hawk's telemetry readings remained anomalous, demanding her attention and expertise, while the foundation of her carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble. The morning air felt different now, charged with possibilities that no one fully understood yet, but that promised to change everything about the dynamics that had governed this place for months. The base operations center hummed with the subdued efficiency of a military nerve center, banks of monitors displaying everything from weather patterns to aircraft positions, while personnel moved between workstations with the practiced urgency of people accustomed to managing multiple crises simultaneously. Miles Hargrove stood behind Sergeant Rebecca Santos as she navigated through layers of archived files, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years managing military databases. The classification levels alone told a story. Most routine training missions generated paperwork that remained accessible for years, but 189S carried the kind of security markings that suggested something far more significant. "Here we go," Santos said, her voice dropping to match the gravity of what was appearing on her screen. "Mission File 189S, June 2019. Operation Nightfall Recovery." The document header contained fragments of information that painted a picture in broad strokes. Multi-platform evacuation, personnel extraction under hostile conditions, classified tactical assets deployed. But the details that would explain Harper's connection to the unit remained locked behind authorization protocols that required general-level clearance. "There's a personnel roster," Santos continued, scrolling through the accessible portions of the file. "But the names are redacted except for command structure." She paused, highlighting a section of text that had survived the classification review. Mission Commander General E. Callahan status: successful evacuation of 347 personnel from compromised forward operating base. Miles felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to align, though the complete picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Any mention of aircraft assets? Multiple platforms deployed, including experimental helicopter units designated for high-risk insertion and extraction. Santos looked up from the screen. Miles. This wasn't training. This was the real thing. The radio on Miles's belt chose that moment to crackle with urgent traffic. All personnel, General Callahan inbound to Hangar 12, ETA 5 minutes. Santos and Miles exchanged glances that carried the weight of sudden understanding. General Callahan's impromptu visit, combined with the 189S file now open on their system, suggested a convergence that went far beyond coincidence. "Print what you can," Miles said, already moving toward the exit, "and keep that file open." Meanwhile, back at Station 3, the crowd around the Black Hawk had grown restless. Durnet's patience with the morning's complications was wearing thin, his earlier confidence beginning to give way to the kind of irritation that came with problems that refused to resolve themselves according to schedule. "I want this settled before the general arrives," he announced to the assembled group. "Clean paperwork, clear accountability, no loose ends." Harper, still working on the platform beside the aircraft, felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with approaching authority. General visits meant inspections, questions, the kind of scrutiny that could expose carefully hidden truths or buried connections. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the dog tag and challenge coin hidden in her toolbox. Objects that suddenly felt less like sentimental keepsakes and more like potential evidence in a case she didn't yet understand. The distant sound of approaching vehicles carried across the tarmac, growing steadily louder. As official motorcade closed the distance to Hangar 12, whatever was about to happen, Harper realized, would either validate her months of careful anonymity or shatter them completely. The morning that had begun with simple humiliation was transforming into something far more complex, carrying implications that reached back years and might extend far into an uncertain future. To be the sound of polished boots on concrete carried a particular authority that made conversation stop mid-sentence and postures straighten automatically. General Everett Callahan moved through Hangar 12 with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, his presence transforming the space from a workplace into something approaching a formal inspection. His uniform bore the crisp perfection that came with decades of military service, ribbons and insignia telling their own story of deployments, commendations and responsibilities that extended far beyond routine base operations. But it was his eyes that carried the real weight. The particular gravity of someone who'd made decisions that changed lives, who carried memories that demanded careful handling. The crowd that had gathered around the Black Hawk parted instinctively as he approached, creating a clear corridor between the general and the aircraft, where Harper still stood on the maintenance platform. The morning's tension, which had been building around workplace hierarchies and petty accusations, suddenly felt insignificant in the face of whatever had brought the base commander here personally. Callahan's gaze swept across the assembled personnel before settling on the Black Hawk, taking in the maintenance setup, the diagnostic equipment, the technical details that spoke to the aircraft's operational status. But when his eyes found Harper on the platform, something in his expression shifted, a momentary pause that suggested recognition, or perhaps the stirring of half-buried memory. "General," Durnet began, stepping forward with the eager efficiency of someone hoping to control the narrative before it could develop in unexpected directions. "We have a minor maintenance issue that we're resolving through standard." "Sergeant," Callahan said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made interruption impossible. "Please arrange for position of attention." The command rippled through the hangar with immediate effect. Conversations ceased entirely, tools were set aside, and 24 personnel moved into formation with the synchronized precision of people who'd performed this ritual countless times. The only sound was the shuffle of boots on concrete and the distant hum of ventilation systems. Harper climbed down from the maintenance platform, her movements careful and controlled as she took her place in the formation. The patch on her coveralls, exposed by the earlier tear, remained visible to anyone who looked closely enough, though she had no way of knowing that its significance was about to become painfully clear. Callahan walked slowly along the formation, his inspection perfunctory but thorough. When he reached Harper, he stopped. His eyes found the 189's patch immediately, and the change in his expression was unmistakable, surprise giving way to something deeper, more complex. "Sergeant Ellingson," he said, and the sound of her name spoken with formal military courtesy sent a shock through the assembled group. Harper's breath caught in her throat. "Sir, that patch," Callahan continued, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Where did you acquire it?" The question hung in the air like a live explosive device. Around them, Harper could sense the shift in attention, the way the morning's casual dynamics had been replaced by something far more serious. "It was issued to me, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Callahan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. Then he turned to address the entire formation, his words carrying the weight of official pronouncement. "What you're looking at," he said, indicating Harper with a gesture that managed to be both formal and protective, "is the uniform patch of the 189th Special Operations Aviation Unit, a classified program that saved over 300 American lives during Operation Nightfall Recovery in June 2019. The silence that followed felt absolute, as if the hangar itself was holding its breath. "Sergeant Ellingson was the primary pilot for that mission," Callahan continued. "Her actions under fire prevented what would have been the largest single-day loss of American personnel in that theater." Durnett's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like water in desert heat. Around the formation, expressions ranged from shock to confusion to something approaching awe. Harper stood at attention, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the hangar walls, while inside her chest, her heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt too tight. The secret she'd carried for months was now public knowledge, but instead of relief, she felt only the familiar weight of exposure, of being seen in ways she'd spent so long trying to avoid. The improvised briefing area in Hangar 12 had taken on the atmosphere of a formal hearing, with General Callahan positioned behind a maintenance table that now served as an impromptu podium. File folders, hastily retrieved from base operations, were arranged before him with military precision, physical evidence of events that had remained classified until this moment. The assembled personnel stood in formation, but the rigid military posture couldn't entirely mask the emotional undercurrents running through the group. Some faces showed embarrassment, others curiosity, while a few displayed the particular kind of attention that came with witnessing history being rewritten in real time. "Operation Nightfall Recovery," Callahan began, his voice carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to delivering briefings on matters of life and death. "Forward Operating Base Delta, June 15th, 2019. Intelligence indicated imminent compromise of the facility, with enemy forces estimated to reach the perimeter within 6 hours. He opened the first folder, revealing documents that bore the heavy black marks of classification redaction, but enough text remained visible to tell a story of coordination, precision, and desperate urgency. Standard evacuation protocols called for a 48-hour timeline, Callahan continued. "We had 6. The 189th Special Operations Aviation Unit was tasked with extracting 347 personnel under conditions that violated every safety protocol in our playbook." Harper remained at attention, but Miles Hargrove could see the subtle signs of stress in her posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become carefully controlled. He'd seen that same response in other veterans, when their service records were exposed unexpectedly, the way old training reasserted itself under pressure. "The mission required pilots with specific qualifications," Callahan said, his eyes finding Harper in the formation. "Advanced tactical training, experience with high-stress insertion and extraction, the ability to operate multiple aircraft types under hostile conditions." Durnett shifted uncomfortably, his earlier accusations now taking on a different character in light of what was being revealed. The simple narrative of workplace incompetence was being replaced by something far more complex, far more significant. "Sergeant Ellingson flew 4 separate extraction runs," Callahan continued, consulting his notes with the precision of someone who'd lived through these events and remembered them in vivid detail. Black Hawks, Chinooks, and 2 experimental aircraft that have since been reclassified. Total flight time, 11 hours and 37 minutes, personnel extracted 347, with 0 casualties. The numbers carried their own weight, speaking to a level of performance that transcended routine military service. Around the formation, Harper could sense the subtle shift in how people were looking at her. No longer the tired maintenance worker who couldn't manage to arrive on time, but someone whose service record demanded respect. The 189th was disbanded following the completion of Operation Nightfall, Callahan said. Personnel records were classified and archived. Recognition was delayed due to the sensitive nature of the mission parameters. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, the kind used for military decorations. The gesture was simple, but it carried symbolic weight that everyone present understood immediately. "Sergeant Ellingson," he said, his voice taking on the formal tone reserved for military ceremonies. "It is long overdue, but the United States Army would like to present you with the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under combat conditions." The silence that followed felt sacred. As if the hangar had been transformed into something approaching a chapel, Harper stepped forward automatically, muscle memory from countless military ceremonies guiding her movements as she accepted the decoration, with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. But it was what Callahan said next that truly changed everything. "I should also mention," he added, his voice carrying a note of personal gratitude that went beyond official recognition, "that I was among the 347 personnel extracted during Operation Nightfall. Sergeant Ellingson didn't just save the mission. She saved my life, and the lives of everyone under my command that day." The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of General Callahan's office, casting long shadows across furniture that spoke to decades of military service. Commendation plaques, unit photographs, and various military memorabilia lined the walls, creating an environment that felt both official and deeply personal. Harper sat in the chair across from Callahan's desk, the Distinguished Flying Cross still in its presentation box on the table between them. The formal ceremony was over. The crowd had dispersed, and now they were left with the more complex matter of addressing what came next. "Coffee," Callahan offered, moving toward a machine that looked far more sophisticated than the one in the maintenance break room. "Please," Harper replied, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion that came with having one's carefully constructed privacy dismantled in front of colleagues. As Callahan prepared the coffee, Harper's eyes moved around the office, taking in details that spoke to a career that had encompassed far more than base administration. Photographs showed him in various deployments, with different units, in circumstances that ranged from formal ceremonies to field conditions that looked genuinely dangerous. "You know," he said, handing her a cup that was significantly better than anything available in the maintenance areas. "I've thought about that day more times than I care to admit." Harper accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth against her palms as an anchor point. "It was a long time ago." "Not long enough to forget," Callahan replied, settling behind his desk with his own cup. "You pulled me out of a situation where I'd pretty much accepted that we weren't all making it home." The admission carried weight that went beyond military courtesy or official gratitude. It spoke to the particular bond that formed between people who'd shared extreme circumstances, who'd depended on each other when everything else had failed. "I was doing my job," Harper said, but even as the words left her mouth, they felt insufficient to describe what had actually taken place during those 11 hours and 37 minutes. "Your job," Callahan repeated, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your job was supposed to be routine transport operations. What you did went so far beyond the scope of normal duties that we had to create new classification categories just to file the paperwork." He opened a folder that had been sitting on his desk, revealing documents that Harper hadn't seen since the debriefing sessions that had followed the mission. Her own signature appeared at the bottom of several pages, but the details had been buried so deeply in classified archives that even she had begun to wonder if the events had really happened the way she remembered them. "The Army owes you more than a medal," Callahan continued. "We owe you proper recognition, career opportunities, and about 6 years' worth of the respect you should have been receiving all along." Harper felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "I don't need special treatment." "This isn't special treatment," Callahan replied firmly. "This is correcting an injustice. You've been working maintenance on aircraft you're qualified to fly, taking orders from people who don't have a fraction of your experience, and accepting treatment that would be inappropriate for any soldier, much less one with your service record. He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew something that made Harper's breath catch, a challenge coin bearing the insignia of the 189th Special Operations Aviation Unit. It was identical to the one hidden in her toolbox, but this one gleamed with the brightness of something that had been carefully preserved rather than carried as a secret talisman. "I'd like to offer you something," he said, placing the coin on the desk between them. "Reactivation to flight status, with retroactive rank restoration and assignment to our Special Operations Liaison program." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying implications that would reshape not just Harper's career, but her entire sense of identity within this organization. "You don't have to answer now," Callahan added, "but I want you to know that the option exists. And Harper, you've earned it." The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of General Callahan's office, casting long shadows across furniture that spoke to decades of military service. Commendation plaques, unit photographs, and various military memorabilia lined the walls, creating an environment that felt both official and deeply personal. The American flag in the corner hung motionless in the still air, its colors muted by the golden light that transformed the utilitarian office into something approaching a sanctuary. Harper sat in the leather chair across from Callahan's desk, the distinguished flying cross still in its presentation box on the polished surface between them. The weight of the medal felt both familiar and foreign. Familiar because she'd earned decorations before. Foreign because this one represented recognition that had been denied for so long she'd stopped believing it would ever come. The formal ceremony was over. The crowd had dispersed, and now they were left with the more complex matter of addressing what came next. "Coffee," Callahan offered, moving toward a machine that looked far more sophisticated than the industrial-grade apparatus in the maintenance break room. His movements carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned to find comfort in small rituals, in the ordinary gestures that provided stability amid the chaos of military life. "Please," Harper replied, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion that came with having one's carefully constructed privacy dismantled in front of colleagues. She watched him prepare the coffee, noting the way his hands moved with automatic efficiency, the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this task thousands of times in offices around the world. As Callahan prepared the coffee, Harper's eyes moved around the office, taking in details that spoke to a career that had encompassed far more than base administration. Photographs showed him in various deployments with different units, in circumstances that ranged from formal ceremonies to field conditions that looked genuinely dangerous. One image, partially obscured by shadow, showed a younger Callahan standing beside a Black Hawk in what appeared to be desert terrain, his expression carrying the particular gravity of someone operating far from home under uncertain conditions. "You know," he said, handing her a cup that was significantly better than anything available in the maintenance areas, "I've thought about that day more times than I care to admit." The coffee was rich, complex, carrying flavors that spoke to careful sourcing rather than institutional procurement. It was a small luxury, but after months of break-room coffee that tasted like bitter water, it felt like an acknowledgement of her worth as something more than just another maintenance worker. Harper accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warmth against her palms as an anchor point, while she processed the implications of what he'd just said. "It was a long time ago, not long enough to forget," Callahan replied, settling behind his desk with his own cup. His chair creaked slightly under his weight, the sound familiar and somehow comforting in its mundane normalcy. "You pulled me out of a situation where I'd pretty much accepted that we weren't all making it home. I was writing letters in my head, you know, the kind you hope never get sent." The admission carried weight that went beyond military courtesy or official gratitude. It spoke to the particular bond that formed between people who'd shared extreme circumstances, who depended on each other when everything else had failed. Harper had carried her own memories of that day, the radio traffic, the mechanical sounds of aircraft under stress, the weight of responsibility that had settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. But she'd never considered how those same events had looked from the ground, from the perspective of someone whose survival had depended entirely on her ability to perform beyond the limits of normal human capability. "I was doing my job," Harper said, But even as the words left her mouth, they felt insufficient to describe what had actually taken place during those 11 hours and 37 minutes. The phrase was true in the narrowest technical sense, but it failed to capture the reality of flying wounded aircraft through hostile territory, of making decisions that balanced the lives of passengers against the mechanical limitations of machines that were operating far beyond their intended parameters. "Your job," Callahan repeated, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The expression transformed his face, revealing traces of the younger officer who'd somehow survived experiences that had claimed others with similar training and preparation. "Your job was supposed to be routine transport operations. What you did went so far beyond the scope of normal duties that we had to create new classification categories just to file the paperwork." He opened a folder that had been sitting on his desk, revealing documents that Harper hadn't seen since the debriefing sessions that had followed the mission. Her own signature appeared at the bottom of several pages, but the details had been buried so deeply in classified archives that even she had begun to wonder if the events had really happened the way she remembered them. The papers were yellowed slightly with age, bearing the particular patina that came with years of careful storage in climate-controlled environments. "Look at this," Callahan said, pointing to a section of text that had survived the classification review process. 4 separate aircraft, 3 different models, mechanical failures on 2 platforms, hostile fire throughout the operational period, weather conditions that grounded every other unit in the theater. He looked up from the papers, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how rarely anyone had truly seen her during the months she'd spent working maintenance. "And you brought everyone home." Harper felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The words were simple, factual, but they carried emotional weight that she'd been denied for years. Recognition not just of her technical abilities, but of the human cost of exercising those abilities under conditions that pushed both equipment and personnel beyond their operational limits. "The Army owes you more than a medal," Callahan continued, his voice taking on the formal tone that preceded important announcements. "We owe you proper recognition, career opportunities, and about 6 years' worth of the respect you should have been receiving all along." The coffee cup felt suddenly heavy in Harper's hands. She set it down carefully on the small table beside her chair, using the moment to process implications that extended far beyond the immediate conversation. "I don't need special treatment." "This isn't special treatment," Callahan replied firmly, his own coffee forgotten as he leaned forward across the desk. "This is correcting an injustice. You've been working maintenance on aircraft you're qualified to fly, taking orders from people who don't have a fraction of your experience, and accepting treatment that would be inappropriate for any soldier, much less one with your service record." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew something that made Harper's breath catch, a challenge coin bearing the insignia of the 189th Special Operations Aviation Unit. It was identical to the one hidden in her toolbox, but this one gleamed with the brightness of something that had been carefully preserved rather than carried as a secret talisman. The metal caught the afternoon light, casting small reflections on the ceiling that danced with each slight movement of Callahan's hand. "I'd like to offer you something," he said, placing the coin on the desk between them with the careful precision of someone presenting a sacred object. "Reactivation to flight status, with retroactive rank restoration, and assignment to our Special Operations Liaison Program. Full recognition of your prior service, access to advanced training programs, and the kind of responsibilities that match your actual capabilities." The offer hung in the air between them, carrying implications that would reshape not just Harper's career, but her entire sense of identity within this organization. She could see herself reflected in the polished surface of the challenge coin, but the image was fragmented, unclear, much like her sense of who she was supposed to become if she accepted what was being offered. "The program would involve training other pilots," Callahan continued, apparently interpreting her silence as a request for more information. "Sharing the expertise you've developed, helping to establish protocols that could prevent other personnel from finding themselves in the kind of impossible situations we faced that day. It's not just about recognition. It's about making sure the knowledge you've gained doesn't disappear into classified archives." Harper picked up the challenge coin, feeling its weight in her palm. The metal was cool to the touch, substantial in a way that suggested permanence, reliability. The insignia was etched with the kind of precision that spoke to military attention to detail, but beneath the formal symbolism, she could sense the human stories that had given the unit meaning, the shared experiences, the mutual dependence, the bonds that had formed under pressure and remained strong enough to survive years of separation and classification. Miles Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his weathered face carrying an expression of careful respect mixed with genuine concern. "Excuse me, General, sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development." Callahan gestured him inside, and Miles approached with the measured step of someone bearing news that might change everything. "It's about Sergeant Durnett. He's requested a formal meeting to issue a public apology and to recommend Harper for immediate promotion within the maintenance division." Harper felt her eyebrows rise involuntarily. "He did what?" "Apparently," Miles continued. "Seeing the ceremony this afternoon made him realize the scope of his misjudgments. He wants to make amends publicly, and he's asked if he can do it in front of the same personnel who witnessed this morning's events." Callahan leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, that's unexpected. What do you think, Harper? Do you want to hear what he has to say?" Harper looked down at the challenge coin still warm in her palm, then back up at both men who were watching her with expressions of genuine interest in her decision. For months, she'd been at the mercy of Durnett's whims, subject to his public humiliations and professional undermining. Now the tables had turned completely, and she found herself in the position of deciding whether to accept his attempt at reconciliation. "I think," she said slowly, "that everyone deserves a chance to do better when they know better." Callahan nodded approvingly. "That's remarkably gracious considering the circumstances. But," Harper continued, her voice gaining strength, "I also think I'm ready to accept your offer, General. It's time I stopped hiding what I'm capable of." The words felt momentous as they left her mouth, carrying implications that would ripple outward through every aspect of her life. But holding the challenge coin, surrounded by people who finally knew and respected her story, Harper felt ready to step forward into whatever came next. The maintenance bay felt different in the early evening light, shadows lengthening across concrete floors that had witnessed the day's transformation from routine humiliation to public recognition. The massive space seemed to breathe differently now, as if the very air had been altered by the morning's revelations. Industrial fixtures cast overlapping pools of illumination that created a complex geometry of light and shadow, transforming the utilitarian environment into something approaching the sacred. Harper walked slowly among the aircraft, her footsteps echoing in the vast space as she processed events that had reshaped not just her immediate circumstances, but her entire relationship with the identity she'd been carrying in secret for so long. Each aircraft she passed, the transport helicopters, the training birds, the maintenance platforms, looked the same as they had that morning, but her connection to them had been fundamentally altered. They were no longer simply machines she was required to service, but tools she was qualified to operate, platforms that represented capabilities she no longer had to hide. The Black Hawk that had started everything sat silent on its platform. The telemetry issues that had drawn her onto the maintenance ladder now resolved through careful diagnosis and methodical repair. Looking at it now, Harper could see both what it was, a sophisticated piece of military hardware requiring constant attention, and what it represented, a bridge between the person she'd been forced to become and the person she'd once been trained to be. The aircraft's sleek lines spoke to engineering excellence, to the marriage of form and function that characterized military aviation at its best. Her toolbox sat open nearby, its contents still arranged with the military precision that had become second nature over years of service. But now the hidden compartment felt less like a refuge for guilty secrets and more like a repository for memories that finally had permission to exist in daylight. The tools themselves looked different too, no longer implements of concealed competence, but professional equipment that matched her actual qualifications. She withdrew the dog tag and challenge coin from their cloth wrapping, holding them in the fading light that streamed through the hangar's high windows. The metal was warm from being carried close to her body for so many months, and the surfaces bore the particular patina that came from being touched frequently, like worry stones worn smooth by anxious fingers. In the golden light of early evening, both objects seemed to glow with their own internal illumination, as if they were finally free to reflect their true significance rather than remaining hidden in shadow. The sound of approaching voices drew her attention toward the hangar entrance, where she could see a small group gathering. Miles Hargrove led the way, followed by the two younger mechanics from dinner. And behind them, walking with careful, measured steps, came Master Sergeant Colin Durnett. His posture had changed since the morning. Less swagger, more uncertainty, the body language of someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. As they approached, Harper could see that Durnett carried a folder under his arm, official-looking documents that suggested this wasn't simply an informal apology, but something more structured, more permanent. His face bore the particular expression of someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about mistakes and their consequences, the kind of deep consideration that sometimes followed moments of public humiliation. "Harper," Miles said as the group reached her position near the Black Hawk. "Colin asked if he could speak with you, and he wanted to do it here, in front of the same people who were here this morning." Durnett stepped forward, his movements lacking the aggressive confidence that had characterized his earlier interactions. Instead, he seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the day's revelations in ways that went beyond simple embarrassment. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that Harper had never heard before. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words emerging with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd rehearsed them but still struggled with their delivery. "Not just for today, but for every day I've treated you as less than you are. I let my own insecurities and assumptions blind me to who you really were." He opened the folder, revealing documents that bore official letterhead and multiple signatures. "I've filed a formal recommendation for your promotion to senior maintenance specialist, with a notation that you were systematically underutilized during your time in my section. I've also requested that my own performance review include documentation of my failure to recognize your qualifications." Harper felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The apology was more comprehensive than she'd expected, extending beyond personal regret to professional accountability. It suggested that Durnett understood not just that he'd been wrong, but why he'd been wrong, and what the consequences of his behavior had been for her career prospects. "I also wanted you to know," Durnett continued, "that I've spoken with General Callahan about establishing new protocols for evaluating personnel transfers. Too many qualified people are falling through the cracks because supervisors like me make assumptions instead of asking questions." Jessica, one of the younger mechanics, stepped forward slightly. "We wanted to be here because we learned something today too, about not judging people based on appearances, about listening instead of assuming." Marcus nodded in agreement. "And about how much we can learn when we pay attention to the people around us instead of writing them off." Harper looked around at the faces surrounding her, Miles with his quiet satisfaction at seeing justice done, the younger mechanics with their earnest desire to do better, and Durnett with his obvious discomfort but genuine commitment to making amends. It was a strange gathering, brought together by circumstances that none of them could have predicted that morning, but united now by shared recognition that something important had changed. "I accept your apology," Harper said, her voice carrying clearly in the vast space of the hangar, "and I appreciate the effort you've put into making things right." She paused, looking down at the dog tag and challenge coin still warm in her palm, then back up at the group. "But I should probably tell you that I've accepted General Callahan's offer to return to flight status. I'll be transitioning to the Special Operations Liaison program." The announcement drew smiles from Miles and the younger mechanics, while Durnett nodded with what appeared to be genuine approval. "That's where you belong," he said simply. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." As the conversation continued, the hangar gradually filled with the natural sounds of evening shift change, distant voices, the hum of auxiliary power units, the rhythmic tick of cooling metal. But around Harper, the atmosphere felt transformed, charged with possibilities that had been absent for months. The dog tag felt warm against her palm as she finally allowed herself to imagine tomorrow, not as another day of hiding her capabilities, but as the beginning of a return to work that matched her actual qualifications. General Callahan's offer represented more than just career advancement. It was recognition that her identity no longer needed to be compartmentalized, that she could integrate all aspects of herself into a coherent professional life. "You know what I realized today?" Harper said, addressing the group but looking specifically at the younger mechanics. I spent so much time trying to be invisible that I forgot what it felt like to be useful. Miles smiled, his weathered face creasing with approval. Well, you won't have that problem anymore. As the group began to disperse, heading toward the exit and the evening routines that waited beyond the hangar, Harper remained behind for a few more minutes. She walked slowly around the Black Hawk, her hand trailing along its fuselage with the automatic gentleness of someone who understood both the machine's capabilities and its vulnerabilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new relationships with people who would know her story from the beginning, rather than discovering it through dramatic revelation. But tonight, standing alone among the aircraft that had defined so much of her adult life, Harper Ellingson felt ready for whatever came next. She closed the dog tag and challenge coin in her fist, no longer secrets to be concealed, but symbols of a past that had finally been allowed to inform her future. The sound of aircraft engines in the distance reminded her that the work continued, that there were always missions to fly, people to protect, responsibilities that demanded the best of everyone involved. But now, finally, Harper could meet those demands with the full range of her capabilities, with the recognition that she had earned the right to be here, not through charity or accident, but through demonstrated excellence under conditions that had tested every aspect of her training and character. The hangar settled into evening quiet around her, but in that silence Harper could hear something that had been absent for months, the sound of her own voice, no longer afraid to speak, no longer forced to pretend she was less than she was. And in that voice she whispered the words that would define whatever came next. Sometimes, all you need to do is land the truth. Stories have the power to remind us that our hidden strengths often emerge when we least expect them.